It was almost 11 o'clock at night on the 4th of July when Christine Wansley's phone rang. It was Warren, and the moment she heard his voice, something shifted. Her son Nolan had not come home. He had not checked in. No one knew where he was. Just hours earlier, he had been on a beach surrounded by thousands of people. Music playing, the Gulf Coast sun sitting heavy over the water, boats lined up as far as the eye could see. He was 18 years old, healthy, strong, a college football player with his whole life coiled like a spring ready to launch. And now, in the middle of the night, on a holiday, his mother was standing in her home, trying to piece together a timeline from people who were there, and whose stories, she would soon discover, did not match. This is the case of Nolan Wells. And the more you learn about what happened on Horn Island on July 4, 2026, the more one question refuses to go away. How does a young man disappear in a crowd of thousands, and no one claims to have seen a thing? Before we go any further, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city and state in the comments below. Let's see how far Nolan's story has reached, because this family deserves for every corner of this country to know his name. Nolan Wells was not a headline before July 4, 2026. He was a person. He was 18 years old, 6 feet 1 inch tall, about 180 pounds, a wide receiver on the Southwest Mississippi Community College football team, and a recent graduate of Ocean Springs High School. By every account from every person who knew him, he was the kind of young man who made people feel noticed. His football coach called him humble, called him respected by everyone in the program without exception. His parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, described a son with a big heart, someone who moved through the world with a warmth that left an impression on people long after he left the room. The night before the trip, July 3rd, Nolan cooked salmon for his parents. He hugged them, he kissed them goodbye. That detail, so ordinary, so unremarkable in the moment, is the kind of thing a mother holds on to when everything that comes after stops making sense. He was not sneaking out. He was not in conflict with anyone at home. He was an 18-year-old looking forward to a day on the water with his friends, the way young people on the Gulf Coast have celebrated the 4th of July for as long as anyone can remember. His closest friend was a young man named Warren. The two had known each other since elementary school. Through middle school, through high school, through their first year of college, Warren said they had never had a real argument. Not once. He described Nolan as someone who never had an unkind word for anyone, ever. That is not a eulogy talking. That is someone who spent years beside a person describing what they actually saw. Warren's group typically gathered at his house or at another friend's place rather than Nolan's, which is why Christine had not personally known all of Nolan's friends the way some people on the internet assumed she should have. But that distance from the parents, Warren made clear, had nothing to do with how close the friendship was. Nolan was family to him. Full stop. On the morning of July 4, 2026, Nolan boarded one of 3 boats with roughly 20 to 30 friends and acquaintances. They pushed off from a private dock in the Ocean Springs area at 9:56 in the morning. That time would later be confirmed by marine tracking data obtained by investigators. Their destination was Horn Island, the federally protected barrier island sitting out in the Mississippi Sound, about 12 miles offshore. It is a place that draws Gulf Coast locals every 4th of July like a gravitational pull. By 11:14 in the morning, the group had arrived. What Warren described when they got there was not a quiet afternoon on a remote island. It was the largest gathering of the year. Boats lined up for what looked like miles along the shoreline. Thousands of people spread across the beach, in some places standing 3 rows deep from the waterline. Music, food, the sound of a holiday crowd in full motion. People Nolan and Warren had not seen since high school were there. They caught up. They moved through the day the way you do when you are young and the summer feels endless. Warren said he crossed paths with Nolan more than once throughout the afternoon, and that every single time, Nolan was relaxed, in good spirits, completely at ease. Nothing about his demeanor suggested anything was wrong. Nothing suggested that afternoon would be the last time anyone in his inner circle would see him standing. Horn Island is beautiful in the way that demands respect. Its sands shift. Its currents are strong and they change without warning. particularly around certain points of the island where the water does not behave the way it looks like it should. Locals who know it well will tell you that on a busy day, with boats churning the water from every direction, conditions around those points can turn fast. On July 4, 2026, it was as crowded as it had ever been, and somewhere in that crowd, at some point in the afternoon, the day changed direction. Sometime after noon, the boat carrying Warren and part of the group began having mechanical problems. It was taking on water. The decision was made to head back to the mainland earlier than planned. This is where the group fractured. Not with argument, not with conflict, but with a simple split. Some would go. Some would stay. Nolan chose to stay. He planned to return to the mainland later with a different group of friends. That was the last confirmed decision anyone from his inner circle can speak to directly. That account, Warren's account of why the boat left early and why Nolan remained behind, is not just a verbal claim. It is supported by documented evidence. A national news outlet later obtained emergency distress audio from that afternoon, a recording of a call placed around 4 in the afternoon by the operator of the boat, reporting the mechanical failure as the group attempted to leave the island. GPS records obtained from state marine authorities confirmed the boat departed Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon, a timestamp precise almost to the minute. Warren's mother, Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, later made a public statement confirming that her son had told her Nolan chose to stay and that the boat had left early because it was taking on water. The departure is not disputed. The reason is not disputed. The GPS says 4:31. The audio exists. The record is clean on that point. What the record cannot tell you is what happened after 4:31. The last confirmed sighting of Nolan Wells places him near the northwestern tip of Horn Island at around 3 in the afternoon. Multiple friends agreed on that location. Multiple friends agreed he had not left with Warren's group, and somewhere between that final sighting and 11 o'clock that night, in a crowd of thousands of people on one of the busiest days the island had ever seen, Nolan Wells vanished. If this case is new to you, pause for 1 second and hit subscribe right now. We cover cases like this every single week, and this one is far from over. And if you have been following Nolan's story since the beginning, I want you to tell me in the comments, what detail has bothered you the most? Because for a lot of people watching, it is about to be the phone. When Warren called Christine just before 11 that night, she moved immediately. She checked Nolan's phone, which had already been retrieved from the island by a friend's mother using Snapchat location data. And what she found on that phone stopped her cold. The phone was, in her words, too clean. There were no videos, no pictures, nothing from an entire day on Horn Island during one of the biggest celebrations of the year. Nolan was the kind of person who captured everything. He documented his life. He was young and present and on a beach surrounded by people he cared about on a holiday. And the phone came back with nothing from that day. The location data made it worse, not better. His Life 360 app showed the phone back on the mainland. But Snapchat told a different story. 2 apps, 2 different locations, 1 phone, and then there was the matter of recovering it in the first place. Christine faced difficulty getting the phone and Nolan's car keys back from the homes where they had ended up. The details around that retrieval would not sit right with her either. By midnight, she had filed a missing persons report with local law enforcement, a process that came with its own layer of complication, because Horn Island sits in federal waters inside the Mississippi Sound, and jurisdiction over who was responsible for the search required sorting out in real time, in the middle of the night, while a mother was still trying to understand what had happened to her son. Before dawn on July 5th, Nolan's father Elmore was already moving. He went to the island by boat alongside Nolan's football coach, unwilling to wait for the sun to be fully up before beginning the search himself. The official response expanded quickly. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the United States Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and other agencies. The United Cajun Navy, the volunteer search and rescue organization that has become one of the most effective civilian search forces in the Gulf South, deployed boats and aircraft, working drift and wind pattern models to determine where the water might have carried someone overnight. The scale of the search, matched the scale of the fear. The beach was still crowded with people. Boats were still anchored along the shore. Some people had stayed overnight. Some were still drinking from the night before. Locals who knew the island described the conditions at the northwestern tip, where Nolan was last seen, as particularly unpredictable. The rip currents along that stretch of water did not announce themselves. They were there, and then they were pulling, and experienced swimmers had been caught off guard by them before. The search went through the entire day of July 5th, and at the end of it, Nolan had still not been found. On the morning of July 6th, a United States Park Service ranger discovered a body at the northwestern tip of Horn Island, the same area where Nolan had last been seen. The body was identified as Nolan Wells through dental records. He was 18 years old. The Jackson County Coroner's Office, noting the condition of the body, requested that the autopsy be conducted at the State Medical Examiner's Office rather than locally. Initial findings noted no immediate signs of physical injury. The cause of death and toxicology results were listed as pending. The Sheriff's Department made a statement indicating they did not, at that early stage, suspect foul play. That phrase, "did not suspect foul play," became the wall the family ran into from the very beginning. Not because they refused to consider every possibility, but because they said the explanation being offered did not account for everything they had been told, everything that had already shifted, and everything that continued to not add up. On July 7th, Christine and Elmore Wansley retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump to lead an independent investigation running parallel to the official one. Crump moved fast. He arranged for Nolan's body to be flown to Washington, D.C., for an independent autopsy conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a respected forensic pathologist. The examination was funded in part by Colin Kaepernick. The results from that independent examination were later described publicly as inconclusive, with further investigation still required before any conclusions could be drawn. That word, inconclusive, did not close a door. It left every door open. On July 10th, Ben Crump and Nolan's family held a press conference in New York City alongside Reverend Al Sharpton. They were not there to issue accusations. They were there to ask questions that they said had not been adequately answered. Why would Nolan, who had always been taught to stay with his group, separate from the people around him? In a crowd of thousands, on one of the busiest days that island had ever seen, how did no one witness what happened to him? Who was the last person to see him? And why did the accounts from the people who were there that day not agree with each other? What time is it where you are right now? And tell me honestly, after everything you've just heard, do you think this was a straightforward accident? Put your answer in the comments, because the next part of this story is where the cracks become impossible to ignore. In the days following the press conference, investigators made a public request. They asked anyone who had been on Horn Island on July 4, 2026, to come forward with original, unedited photos and videos from that day, particularly anything showing alleged confrontations or containing footage of Nolan. That ask said something. It meant the investigators themselves believed there was more to find. It meant the visual record of that day had not been fully assembled. It meant that in a crowd of thousands of people carrying phones, the picture of what happened was still incomplete. A video began circulating online during this period. In the footage, you could hear what sounded like a heated argument, voices raised, tension audible even through the noise of a crowded beach. The clip spread rapidly across social media, fueling speculation about what had happened in the hours before Nolan disappeared. Then one of the friends came forward and identified his own voice in the recording, not Nolan's voice, his. The argument that people had been pointing to as potentially significant had a different explanation, but even that clarification raised its own question. How many other pieces of footage from that day were being misread? And how many had not surfaced at all? Then came a detail that the family described as one more example of the inconsistencies they kept running into. There was a young woman, someone Nolan reportedly met on the island that day. According to Christine, this young woman had reached out to her early in the process. She described their interaction with Nolan as brief, a hello, a goodbye, nothing more than a passing exchange between strangers on a crowded beach. Christine listened to that account, and then she compared it to what she heard from other people who were also there that day. The two versions did not match. The young woman's description of what passed between them and the picture that emerged from other accounts were not the same story. Christine did not use that discrepancy to level an accusation. She used it to point at a pattern. This was not the only account that had shifted or changed. It was one more data point in a case where the data points kept pulling in different directions. Ben Crump addressed this directly. He did not speak in probabilities or careful hedging when he described the state of the witness accounts. He said plainly that the stories from that day simply did not match. Someone, in his words, was telling the truth. Someone was not. And until investigators worked through those contradictions and determined which was which, the case could not move forward with real confidence. That assessment, from the attorney leading the independent investigation, was not a political statement. It was a description of where the evidence actually stood. Now, Warren. His name had been in the background of this story since the beginning. The friend who was with Nolan on the island. The friend whose boat left early. The last member of Nolan's inner circle to speak publicly on camera. His interview with the Officer Tatum show was the first time he sat down and gave a full, detailed account of what he witnessed that day. And the weight of that interview was shaped by everything that came before it. Warren described a friendship that had no cracks in it. Elementary school through college, not one real argument. He described Nolan as someone incapable of making an enemy, someone whose name you could drop in any room and watch people smile. He talked about the day on the island the way someone who was genuinely present talks about it. The scope of the crowd, the atmosphere, the specific moments when he and Nolan crossed paths and spoke. His account of the departure was consistent with every piece of documented evidence. The boat had a mechanical problem. They left early. Nolan chose to stay. 4:31 p.m. GPS confirmed. Distress call confirmed. His mother's public statement confirmed. But Warren's interview did not resolve the case. It could not, because what Warren could speak to was the part of the day he witnessed directly. Everything that happened after he left the island at 4:31, the hours between that departure and 11 o'clock that night, was a gap that no one in Nolan's inner circle had been able to fill with any account that held together without contradiction. The scrutiny Warren faced was substantial. As the son of Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, he was not an anonymous figure in the community. His family's public standing made his weeks of silence before the interview read differently to different people. Some saw a young man processing grief and navigating the advice of people around him. Others saw something more deliberate. His mother went public about the reality of their situation. Her family had received threats serious enough that she was genuinely afraid for the safety of her children. She said Warren had cooperated fully with investigators. She said her son had not withheld anything. But a public panel reviewing the timing of the interview made the point directly. Even if every single word Warren said proved to be completely true, he was now speaking into a conversation that had been shaped by weeks of suspicion. And suspicion, once it takes hold, does not release easily. That is not a judgment of Warren. It is a description of the environment this case had created, and it matters because it illustrates how difficult the path to clarity had become by the time his interview aired. The questions that still could not be answered were not going to disappear because one person finally spoke on camera. The accounts that contradicted each other were not going to reconcile because the GPS data and the distress audio had been confirmed. The racial dimension of this case was never hidden and should not be sidestepped here. In several group photos taken from the trip on July 4th, Nolan appeared to be the only person of color. His family and his community noted that explicitly. They raised the question of whether the speed with which investigators leaned toward an accidental explanation was influenced by who Nolan was and what Mississippi's history looks like when you hold it up to the light. The Jackson County Knockup formally began monitoring the investigation to ensure that racial bias was not shaping the process. That monitoring was not an accusation, it was accountability. It was what communities have learned they must do when the people they love end up in cases where the official explanation arrives quickly, and the families are expected to accept it just as fast. The family did not accept it. Not because they were unwilling to face hard truths, but because the explanation that was being leaned toward, that Nolan had simply wandered off, lost track of time, and accidentally drowned, did not account for what they knew. It did not account for the phone that came back empty of any documentation from that day. It did not account for the conflicting location data across 2 apps. It did not account for the young woman's version of events not lining up with other accounts from the island. It did not account for the contradictions between friends that Ben Crump had described openly and on the record. And it did not account for the way the story around their son had continued to shift in the weeks since his body was found. Not moving toward clarity, but moving in the other direction. On July 15th, the Jackson County District Attorney met with the family. The meeting was described publicly as constructive. The DA agreed to a mutual inspection of Nolan's cell phone. Experts from the official investigation and experts retained by the family would both examine the device. What that examination would yield had not been publicly disclosed at the time of the most recent statements. Law enforcement continued to ask for patience. They acknowledged that social media speculation had created an environment full of noise and unverified information, including AI-generated images and videos that were being circulated as if they were real. They maintained that no clear signs of foul play had been identified, and they asked the public to allow the process to work. The family heard that ask, and they continued to hold both things at once: the grief of having lost their son and the obligation of making sure the investigation did not close before it had actually opened. Christine was still trying to understand 2 different versions of the last conversation a stranger claimed to have had with Nolan on a beach. Elmore was still asking why the story being offered to explain how his son died did not match the son he raised, a young man who stayed close to his people, who did not wander, who had always been taught to stay together. His siblings walked past a bedroom that had not changed since the beginning of July. A family suspended in the space between what had been confirmed and what could not yet be explained, unable to set down their grief because they could not yet put it next to the truth. The evidence record was clear, on a narrow set of facts. Marine tracking data confirmed the departure at 9:56 in the morning. GPS confirmed the arrival at Horn Island at 11:14. The distress call audio confirmed a mechanical failure around 4 in the afternoon. GPS records confirmed the boat departed at 4:31. Multiple friends confirmed Nolan chose to stay. His body was found on the morning of July 6th at the northwestern tip of the island, the same location where he had last been seen. No immediate signs of physical injury were documented. Toxicology was pending. The independent autopsy result was inconclusive. Everything outside of those confirmed facts was still being contested. The young woman's account, the condition of the phone, the contradictions between friends that the family's own attorney had described as central to the investigation. The events of the hours between 4:31 and 11 at night, the hours that mattered most, remained a space where documented evidence ended and conflicting accounts began. That was the state of the case, not resolved, not narrowed, widened. If this video has moved you, if Nolan's story has stayed with you the way it has stayed with his mother, his father, the people who watched him grow up and watched him step into a future that was taken from him before it had a chance to begin, please share this video. That is not a small ask. Sharing moves a story. It puts a name in front of someone who had never heard it. It creates the kind of attention that makes it harder for a case to be quietly set aside. Subscribe so you are here when we cover the next development, because this case is not over. And leave a comment. Tell me what you think happened on that island on July 4th, 2026. Tell me what part of this story you cannot stop thinking about. I read every single comment, and I want to know what you see that others might have missed. A mother said goodbye to her son on July 3rd, 2026. He hugged her. He kissed her. He had cooked dinner for his family that evening, and then he went to bed looking forward to a holiday on the water with the people he loved. 2 days later, he was found on the northwestern tip of an island, identified through his dental records, gone at 18 years old. In the weeks since, the case did not move toward a clean answer. It moved outward. It pulled in emergency audio and GPS timestamps and independent autopsies and press conferences and friend interviews and a phone that came back empty. It pulled in a community asking questions that had not been answered, and a family doing the impossible work of grieving while simultaneously refusing to let the story be written before the truth had been found. Somewhere between what the records confirm and what the accounts cannot agree on, something happened to Nolan Wells. And somewhere on that island, or somewhere in the memory of someone who was there that day, the answer to what actually happened is still waiting to be told. The question is whether anyone will finally tell it.